quite an interesting heavyweight fight. Actually, there's two quite interesting heavyweight fights on the 26th of November. The one this video about is the fight between Kingpin Johnson and Odlanier Solis. I will do another video close to the time for another fight that I view as quite interesting between Andy Ruiz and Tor Hamer. And I guess the reason that these fights are so interesting is you got four essentially, maybe with the exception of Solis, fringe contenders in the sense that they're, highly rated heavyweights, probably not in the top 10, as I say, with the exception of Solis, who are actually going in against competitive opposition. So I know Andy Ruiz is very highly rated, and I think Tor Hamer's a good test for him. And at the same time, obviously, Solis is very, very highly rated. He's obviously got his title shot against Klitschko before, but I think this Kevin Johnson fight is a really interesting and competitive fight. So I wanted to focus on that one and do a little bit of a breakdown and analysis on it, really. Solis comes to the ring 20 wins, 13 of those 20 wins coming by way of knockout. One loss, that loss obviously being the first round, it was given as a TKO to Vitali Klitschko. And I guess you could say about that one, Solis went down, twisted a knee, and it was a knee injury essentially that stopped that fight. So it's hard to sort of call that a genuine loss, if you like. Kevin Johnson, 29 wins, 3 losses. 14 of his 29 wins coming by way of knockout. 3 losses are to Tor Hamer, who I've already mentioned once in this video, Tyson Fury, and also Vitali Klitschko. So both of these men have been beaten by Vitali Klitschko. Kevin Johnson has never been stopped in his career. He lost on decision to all 3 of those people who beat him. I think against Klitschko and Fury, he wasn't very competitive. There's an argument that he pretty much lost every round in both of those fights, and that's something that I'll come on to in a moment. But this is a tough guy in the sense that he doesn't get stopped. He doesn't seem to have any chin concerns, and that's why it's one of the reasons why it's a good test for Solis. And in the first part of this video, I just wanted to focus a bit on Odlanier Solis. He obviously is a highly touted Cuban amateur boxer. He had 347 wins as an amateur, 12 losses. I think I watched a video on YouTube the other day of him actually fighting David Haye in the amateurs, and David Haye causing a bit of trouble early on, but him working his way in and winning it over the as it got into the later rounds. Now, quite a highly touted boxer. Obviously very, very talented in terms of his hand speed, head movement, foot movement. He's very good technically. He throws punches technically soundly. And it's probably because of that pedigree that he was fast-tracked and got to fight Vitali Klitschko at quite an early stage of his career. He's not a young man because of that amateur background. I think he's 33, whereas Johnson's 34. But given the amount of fights he'd had at the time, I think about 17 it might have been, it was early on in his career to get a fight against one of the Klitschkos. Now, since then, he's been struck slightly with inactivity. I think he fought in April, and then he fought in July, and now he's fighting in November. So that's not too bad, really. 3 heavyweight fights in the year. But before that, he'd been very, very, very inactive. And his comeback fight was against Leif Larsen this year. That was the fight I referred to in April, who was 17-0, big undefeated Norwegian bloke. And I thought after watching that fight that Solis was pretty much done for. I know Solis won that fight with unanimous decision. All 3 judges scored it in his favour. I actually had it as a draw. Now, the way Solis fought in that fight, you could tell he was the superior fighter, that he's the quality individual. But his work rate was just so poor, and he just sort of gifted rounds to Larsen just by, letting Larsen fight at range, taking his, jab off the much bigger man. And every time Solis looked to turn up the pace, he was clearly the better fighter, but he did so little over the course of the fight. I really think it could have gone either way. What frustrated me about that fight is after I saw the first round, I thought this was going to be an easy night for Solis. I thought he might want to do a few rounds as he'd been inactive, but I saw him just getting rid of Larsson quite quickly. I mean, the guy, Larsson, was woeful as a boxer. You know, he's 37, 38. He's one of these big guys. I think he might have been in American football. Came to the sport very late. His jab was just, it was so amateurish just to even look at the way he threw a jab. Like, it was so technically poor, especially in comparison to Solis. And you just thought it would be a very, very easy night's work for Solis, and it looked like he was going to completely outclass him. But he literally gifted rounds to Larsson. There was, I think, I gave Larsson 4-7 in that fight. It's just, Solis looked unfit. He was overweight. He wasn't throwing a lot. He was very low work rate, and he literally, made that fight into much more hassle than it needed to be. So I thought after that he was done for, really. He was overweight. He already had his chance against Klitschko, and he looked really, really poor in victory against Larsson. His next fight out, he looked very decent against Jakub Saglam, I believe it's pronounced, who was 26-3. I watched that fight as well, and Solis looks much, much better in that fight. He was throwing, his punches looked faster, snappier, harder. He's throwing more combinations. His work rate was slightly higher. I mean, again, there were times that he looked lazy in the fight. I'm not going to pretend it was a totally rejuvenated performance, but yeah, he was much better, much improved from the Larsson fight against, an opponent who he should have beaten, but was possibly same level, maybe even slightly higher than Larsson. So I, in hindsight, looking back at that, think that perhaps some of the Larsson weakness in that fight can be blamed on ring rust. I think, Solis came out having had a fight, only a few months earlier. He didn't look quite as heavy. Don't get me wrong, he still had a low work rate. He still did look overweight, but he seemed slightly higher work rate, slightly quicker hands, slightly heavier punches. He was landing hurtful body punches, and he won by a stoppage in the 7th round, which didn't really look on the cards in the Larsson fight. He's got this big looping overhand right, and it was quite a spectacular punch that actually ended the fight in this one in his last fight. Really, it was almost like a highlight reel punch that scored the stoppage. So I think Solis is, he's technically very good. Hand speed is there, footwork is there, boxing brain is there. Technically, he's sound. And as I say, he's only been beaten in a kind of fluke loss to Klitschko. I'm not saying he'd have won that fight, but it's hard to call it a clean loss. So there's a lot in his favour. What's not in his favour is, as I say, it's the work rate, it's how hard he's training, it's how motivated he is. And I also think there's a slight lack of punching power there. Now, I know I've just said he landed a highlight reel knockout, and I know he's had 20 wins and won 13 of those by knockout, but I don't think this chap's like a devastating one-punch knockout artist. He's blown quite a lot of inferior opposition out, but I just don't think he's the most natural finisher I've ever seen. And I think when he steps up in class, and I do view Kevin Johnson as a step up in class, especially compared to his last two fights, obviously not Klitschko, but his last two fights, I see him as more of a a guy who's going to score points wins rather than knockouts. So that's Solis. Pros and cons there, but he's clearly a fighter with immense pedigree and immense potential. Kevin Johnson, similar age, 34. Again, we're not looking at the biggest puncher in the world here. 29 wins, 14 by knockout, but the guys he's knocked out have been quite like inferior standard of competition, and whenever he's been in more recently he's been scoring knockouts in like the later half of rounds, like last round of the fight. I think in his last fight he got a knockout in the 10th round. He's not like a sort of one punch knockout artist. He's more of a guy who's going to kind of grind you down in that sense. Interestingly, every time he stepped up in class, Tor Hamer in the prize fighter tournament, it's hard to say if that's really a step up in class, but I think Klitschko and Tyson Fury were both steps up in class. They were both a sort of taller guy, and also sort of, towards the top of the rankings. both times he's kind of put in quite poor performances. He's fought very defensively. He looked like a kind of man who didn't want to get knocked out, kind of went into a cell. He looked very unambitious against Vitaly Klitschko in particular, and also at times in the Fury fight. He didn't really look like he was there to win. He didn't look like he believed he was going to win. He more looked like a sort of quite savvy bloke who wanted to collect his money and who didn't want to get hurt. And I mean, fair enough to him, but I think Solis is, he is a top 10 heavyweight, certainly a top 15 heavyweight, and he represents a step up from what, Kevin Johnson's last fight, and from, the type of opposition that Johnson's really been winning against. So my big question is, will Kevin Johnson actually turn up to fight and to win this? Or will he turn up like he did with Fury, like he did with Klitschko, to collect his money and to not get hurt? Because I think with Solis's work rate problems and with Kevin Johnson's tendency to sort of, get into a defensive cell on the ropes and not throw too much and be very, defensively minded, it could turn into a boring 12-round fight with not too much action if we're not careful. I don't see either of these guys having huge knockout power, and I also think both of them are very, very good chins. Solis, obviously, his loss came against, it was technically a TKO, but he wasn't defeated by a punch. Kevin Johnson's never been knocked out. I don't even think he's ever been looked like being knocked out, and he's been in there with some punches like Vitaly and Tyson Fury. So this is a guy who doesn't take a lot of punishment, and when he does take it, his chin holds up well. So I see this as a 12-round fight. And I think it's going to be a very tactical chess type game, really. I think both of these guys have got good technical abilities. Both of these guys have got good defensive work, good jabs, etc. I do see Solis as being the higher pedigree fighter with his amateur background, Cuban style. I think if Solis turns up in prime shape, if he continues, he needs to be in better shape than he was in his last fight, but if he continues the upward curve from Leif Larson to Jakob Saglen to this fight, and if he continues on the upward trajectory, he probably will have too much for Kevin Johnson. What he needs to realise is that this fight is highly likely to go 12 rounds due to the way Johnson fights. So because of that, he needs to be in tip-top condition. He can't be, get tiring towards the end of the fight, because Kevin Johnson's a 12-round fighter. He's done that numerous times, and he will be there towards the end of the fight. So Solis needs to be in good shape. He needs to get his jab going. He needs to bring the fight to Johnson and not just let Johnson fight on his back foot with his jab, not let Johnson nick a few rounds by letting his work rate down. Because Johnson's a very savvy bloke, and whereas Leif Larson nicked a few rounds almost by mistake and didn't realise when he needed to push on. Johnson won't make those same mistakes, and if Larson comes in and fights like he did against Larson, he's going to get beaten by Johnson here. So I think it's an interesting fight, because I think it's a step up for both guys in terms of recent competition. I think the person who wins will have credibility as a top 10 level heavyweight. Potentially some big fights around the corner. There's already been murmurings that the winner of this one could be up against Mike Perez when he makes his return. Obviously, with that Cuban connection, Perez versus Solis is an interesting one. So yeah, it's an interesting fight. My prediction is Solis by points. As I say, I think not too much knockout power and two very good chins and good defences at work. So I think Solis on points. I think the fight either goes two ways. I think the first way is Kevin Johnson doesn't really turn up, like he didn't against Klitschko, like he didn't against Tyson Fury, and just tries not to get hurt, in which case Solis wins, like a lopsided decision. Or I think Solis turns up and is lazy, has a low work rate, and allows Johnson into the fight like he did Larson. I think that's the big danger, and then it becomes a tricky fight. And Johnson's got a little bit of class about him. Like if he allows Johnson in like he allowed Larson, he could find himself in trouble. Either way, I think Solis would probably have too much, but I think a Solis points victory is the most likely here. I'd be very interested to hear from people, as is always the case. It's probably of more interest if you actually disagree with me on this one, because I'd be interested if you think that Solis is going to knock Kevin Johnson out, if you see that happening, or I'd be interested if you see Kevin Johnson winning the fight. If you think Solis is too lazy, will allow him too much room to get into it. Or if you, and I don't see how you would, but if you did fancy Johnson by knockout, I'd be interested to hear about that as well. So please leave your comments below. There's a lot of heavyweight action at the minute. We've got the prize fighter tournament next week. As I said, we've got this Andy Ruiz Tor Hamer fight coming out that I'll try and do a video on. We've got Hughie Fury announcing today he's fighting for a WBC youth title. You've got Ian Lewison calling out Richard Towers at the minute, which would make for quite an interesting fight. You've obviously got Hay Fury on the in the horizon. Lucas Brown versus David Price could be an interesting one. There seems to be a lot going on, so it's exciting times in the heavyweight division. I do realise the majority of vids I've done recently have been more on the heavyweight side, so we'll try and intersperse that with some of the other weights. But I do love a good heavyweight fight, I think. But anyway, please do leave your comments below. Who do you think is going to win this fight? Where do you think the winner should go? Where do you think the loser will go? I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. Thanks very much for watching.